The movie opens in a world where supers are now more prominent than ever. After saving the world once again, Bob and his family have come to gain the utmost respect from the public. They don't have to live a miserable life anymore. However, there are still some restrictions when it comes to them fighting crimes. Moving forward, the scene shifts to Rick Dicker, who seems to be interviewing Tony Reidinger, Violet's crush. In the interview, Tony says that he had just asked Violet Parr out at the track meet when the notorious outlaw known as Underminer attacked Metroville. As Tony took cover, he says that he thought he saw superheroes, and that was when he noticed Mr. Incredible, Elastigirl, Violet, Dash, and Jack about to spring into action. Then, he claims to have seen one of the superheroes get angry and throw down her mask. That was the moment Tony found out that the girl who threw her mask was actually Violet, who had gotten annoyed after being told to look after Jack. Toward the end of the interview, Tony goes on to say that he just got too freaked out after seeing Violet and ran away. However, just then, Tony's memory is then erased by Dicker. The scene then changes to the Battle of the Incredibles with the Underminer, where Bob is attempting to prevent the villain from drilling any further into the city. While he does so, Lucius, who's also known as Frozone, joins the fight. Violet tries to leave Jack with Dash, but they keep pawning off the baby on each other as they race to help their parents. Bob pursues the Underminer as he robs the Metroville bank. However, this results in a fight. The Incredibles then try to stop the drill from hitting the town hall, but they are apprehended and detained. That's when the cops show up and scold the supers for causing damage and allowing the Underminer to flee. Dicker drives the family back to their motel and informs them that the supers' relocation program has been officially closed down as a result of the incident. Dicker informs Bob that the family can stay at the motel for another 2 weeks, after which they will be on their own. Later, at dinner, Bob and Helen must explain to the kids that, while they enjoyed fighting crime as a family, it is still illegal for supers to do their jobs in public. The kids then start arguing with their parents about how none of them are allowed to help their parents in defeating the villains. Then, Bob and Helen start fighting with each other, but soon, they calm down and start talking about their situation. While Bob and Helen are talking outside, Lucius comes over and tells them about a man he met during the Underminer battle. He then states that the latter wants to meet all three of them together and talk about their superhero stuff. He also tells them that they're supposed to show up in their original superhero costumes. Soon, Bob, Helen, and Lucius arrive at DevTech, which happens to be owned by Winston Deaver, a massive Supers fan. Winston greets all three of them excitedly and he gets along really well with them. Just then, Evelyn, Winston's sister, joins them. Winston eventually goes on to explain that their father was also a huge fan of supers, and he even donated to superhero causes, raised money, and helped in any way he could. Not only that, he had also descended from heroes such as Gazerbeam and Firenick. However, after the supers were forced to flee, he was heartbroken. As time went on, their home was broken into. During such a time of crisis, Winston's father couldn't reach either hero. Because of this, he was sadly murdered by the criminals for trying to call for help. Their mother too passed away months later from heartbreak. As a result, Winston wishes to bring supers back into the spotlight and change the public's perception of them. He wants to make all superheroes legal again. But much to Bob's dismay, Evelyn has designed cameras for the supers' suits to monitor their activities. They don't want any mishaps anymore, and due to this very reason, the Deavers want Elastigirl to be the face of their movement. This is because she has a much better track record of not causing destruction during her heroics. Finally, the Deavers ask Helen what her answer is, and she replies saying that she doesn't know. At home, Bob and Helen discuss the mission, including the risks of breaking the law and leaving Helen's family. Helen tries to reason with Bob, telling him about the kids' problems, but it doesn't work. Finally, Bob then persuades Helen to go ahead with it so that their children will have the opportunity to save lives in the future. Helen then dials Winston's number and accepts the mission. Winston then moves the family into one of his homes, which is huge, and provides Helen with a motorcycle so she can complete her mission. Helen doesn't like her new suit though, as it is much darker than her original one. It turns out, their new house has an indoor pool as well. Helen becomes aware of a potential threat as a new bullet train is unveiled. The train does indeed reverse, and Helen disguises herself as Elastigirl to save the passengers. She makes it onto the train and notices that the conductor is in a trance. Helen separates the train cars, preventing them from falling off the tracks. When Helen tries to talk to the conductor, he snaps out of his trance, and a message appears on the screen saying, "Welcome back, Elastigirl, the Screenslaver." Since Helen is now gone, Bob is left with looking after the children, from getting them to school to tucking them in bed. At the end of the day, he is really tired when he receives a call from Helen, who asks about how everyone is and also talks about her accomplishments. However, Bob is both proud and irritated because he wishes he was the one receiving the credit. Not only that, he also appears to be having a lot of trouble adjusting to parenting on his own, as Dash needs assistance with complicated math homework and Violet is upset because Tony forgot about their date. As days pass by, Bob attempts to lull Jack to sleep, but soon, Bob himself falls asleep while Jack watches a crime show on the television. Just then, Jack notices a raccoon outside going through the garbage and perceives it as an intruder. Before engaging in a brawl with the raccoon, Jack uses one of his many powers by phasing through the glass. He catches fire, shoots laser beams from his eyes, and transforms into a monster before scaring the raccoon away. After hearing all the commotion, Bob rushes out to find him, and then sees Jack with multiple clones of him. When Bob sees this, Bob is ecstatic as Jack has powers too. This makes him really happy and motivated. Later on, Bob even decides to become acquainted with Dash's schoolwork in order to assist him. Elsewhere, Helen appears on a talk show hosted by Chad Bentley. She meets Ambassador Selleck before going on camera, who expresses her admiration for Elastigirl. Chad, like the rest of the crew, falls into a trance as the interview begins. Helen dashes out to the choppers escorting the ambassador, realizing this is the work of the Screenslaver. She infiltrates the choppers and saves the ambassador's crew before rescuing Selleck as the chopper crashes and burns. On the other hand, Violet tries to talk to Tony at school, thinking he stood her up because he freaked out when he saw her in her suit, but he doesn't remember her at all. When she mentions it to Bob, he inadvertently reveals that Dicker erased Tony's memory of her. Violet becomes enraged and abandons her superhero identity. Bob calls Dicker to see what he knows about Tony in order to help him, and Dicker mentions a restaurant owned by Tony's parents, where Tony works as a waiter. Bob takes the kids there to make amends with Violet, but when she realizes that the waiter is actually her crush, she freaks out and squirts water out her nose. This makes her feel more humiliated than ever, making her even angrier with Bob. Meanwhile, Helen is having the time of her life. She seems to be having a lot of fun driving down the road and looking at all the fans she now has waiting for her. Soon, she looks at the sign a little girl has which says that Screenslaver is still out there. Distressed, Helen goes to Winston, who congratulates her heartily. However, Helen isn't happy as she didn't get to catch the Screenslaver. A while later, Winston and Evelyn introduce Helen to a group of supers from across the country, including Void, a young woman who adores Elastigirl and possesses the ability to create portals. Some of the other supers include Reflux, an elderly super who spews lava, Crushhour, who can compact anything with his powers, and Brick, a massive mutant with brute strength. Helen then discusses Screenslaver with Evelyn, and she devises a plan to catch the villain by staging another interview and locking onto his signal. On the other hand, Bob continues to adjust to Jack abilities even though the child is a handful. His powers are way too much and clearly out of control. Jack can teleport between dimensions and be summoned with cookies, but if he is denied a cookie, he transforms into his monster form. Tried and disgruntled, Bob calls Lucius for assistance, and even he thinks Jack's abilities are rather strange. Meanwhile, Dash notices an auction from a man who owns Mr. Incredible's old high-tech car, the Incredibile. However, Bob is irritated because he still has the remote to control it, which he takes out and uses to activate the car to scare the people on TV. Elsewhere, an interview is set up with Helen looking out the window of a nearby tower, hoping to spot Screenslaver. Much like her expectation, the villain hijacks the interview once more to taunt the audience and talks about how everyone depends on supers to protect them. This time, Helen is adamant about catching her enemy and somehow manages to track him down. She travels across the city to an apartment where she discovers evidence of his plotting and technology, just before Screenslaver discovers her. Screenslaver then flees after planting a bomb in the apartment. Just then, Helen apprehends him outside and unmasks him, revealing an ordinary pizza delivery guy with no memory of what he was doing. Soon enough, the apartment explodes, destroying all the gathered evidence. Back home, Bob is unable to sleep after caring for the children. He now has a beard and huge dark circles under his eyes. As he's really tired of all this, Violet calls Lucius for help. However, Lucius is freaked out by Jack's powers for a second. He tries for a bit and then calms down eventually. That's when they all sit down and talk about Jack's powers. Having no other option left, Bob then drives Jack to Edna Mode's house. While she is not used to being around children, she is captivated when she discovers that one of Jack's powers is shapeshifting, allowing him to take on her appearance. After seeing that Jack is truly extraordinary, Edna agrees to look after him and assist Bob. On the other hand, while celebrating Helen's capture of Screenslaver, Winston calls her to the stage to congratulate her, and also happily announces that superheroes are legal again. Just then, Helen notices something strange in a photograph of the villain. He had a screen with his own image shown from the camera in her own suit. While Helen tries to understand what's going on, Evelyn joins her. Helen then expresses her concern to Evelyn as they examine Screenslaver's mask. That's when Helen figures out everything. She finds out that the pizza guy was not a villain but was actually controlled by the screens in his goggles. Helen immediately pulls out a pair of mind-controlling goggles, but Evelyn pushes the goggles onto Helen's face, revealing herself as the villain. Meanwhile, Bob finally returns to Edna to see if she has managed to keep Jack under control, and if she has also created a suit to accommodate all of Jack's abilities. Much to his surprise, Edna has actually taken really good care of Jack. She then shows Bob all of Jack's powers one by one, but that's when Jack causes a massive fire. Eventually, Edna tells Bob that he doesn't need to pay her. Hearing this, Bob thanked her heartily before driving back to his home. On the other hand, Helen finally awakens tied to a chair and is super cooled to keep her from stretching. Evelyn admits to being Screenslaver and then claims that she pre-recorded Screenslaver's messages and used the pizza guy as a pawn. Her reasoning for this is that she has a grudge against supers because of her father's reliance on them. Instead of finding a good hiding spot during the burglary, he chose to put his life onto some super's hand. Another reason is that she just can't stand Winston's love for them. She wishes to keep supers illegal. After getting all this out of her chest, Evelyn enables the mind control goggles again and says that she is going to use Helen instead of eliminating her to make supers illegal forever. Helen, who is under Evelyn's control, calls Bob to inform him of a problem. In turn, Bob immediately summons Lucius to come by and look after the kids while he goes to investigate. Just like the other times, Lucius' wife, Honey, is not pleased. Void and the other supers arrive not long after Bob leaves, all controlled by Evelyn's goggles. Lucius arrives in time for him to use his freezing powers to keep them at bay, but they eventually catch up with him and put the goggles on him. Just then, Dash discovers the Incredibles remote and calls it to the house. Soon after, he and Violet take Jack and flee the house before the supers arrive. They then decide to go help their parents. Thankfully, the car is smart enough to assist them. A while later, Bob meets Helen at DevTech, where she fights him for some time but soon after kisses him as a distraction before putting on the mind control goggles. As Winston has organized an event on his yacht where world leaders will lift the ban on the supers, Evelyn wants to seize the opportunity to permanently turn the world against the supers. On the other hand, the kids are on their way to DevTech as well. There, they miss the yacht as it sails away, but the Incredible somehow catches up to it by riding swiftly across the water. The three then manage to jump on the yacht where Violet uses her powers to protect them. She creates a force field to make sure they reach the yacht unharmed. Afterward, Violet turns invisible and leaves Dash to deal with Jack. But, due to Jack's powers, he has a hard time keeping an eye on him. They soon board the yacht and attempt to locate their parents. However, that's when the hypnotized supers locate and pursue them. A huge fight ensues where Violet and Dash try their hardest to keep off the hypnotized supers. The two along with little Jack somehow manage to escape them using his powers. At the same time, the world leaders finish signing their agreement, but because the event is being televised, Evelyn uses Bob, Helen, and Lucius to come forward and state their eerily sinister intentions. As Evelyn directs the supers to steer the yacht toward the city, the children locate their parents. They then successfully remove the goggles from their parents and Lucius, who must now fight the hypnotized supers team to remove their goggles as well. Meanwhile, Evelyn grabs Winston and tries to flee on her jet after realizing that the supers are no longer under her control. She tries to run away, but that's when a very disheartened Winston asks Evelyn what she has done. Despite this, she refuses to answer and just tries to escape instead. Turns out that Winston was never involved in any of this as he was and always has been a true fan of the supers. Because of this, he refuses to join his sister and jumps back onto the ship. Soon after, Helen begins pursuing Evelyn with the assistance of Void, while Bob and the others attempt to prevent the yacht from hitting the city. Void uses her portal powers to transport Helen to the jet, but Evelyn releases a gas that causes Helen to go insane before leaving her to run out of oxygen till she passes away. Fortunately, Helen pulls out a flare gun and blasts Evelyn out of the jet before taking control and steering it into the ocean after ejecting herself. Finally, Helen grabs Evelyn, and Void manages to assist them in returning to the yacht. Bob and Lucius then successfully stop the yacht by creating a snow wave to slow it down as it comes to a halt. Towards the end, Winston thanks Helen for saving Evelyn after she is arrested. The world leaders stand firm in their decision, and a judge permanently lifts the ban on supers. Once everything is over, Violet approaches Tony at school and introduces herself again. She finally musters up all her courage and asks him to go on a date to the movies, but her entire family joins them. As they approach a theater, they notice two robbers speeding down the street after an apparent robbery. Seeing that the Incredibles are in need, Violet promises to return soon after her family drops Tony off. The Incredibles then suit up and return to fighting crime as a family.